Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have an incredible episode, but I'm going to mix up things for you guys today, and it's going to be a little bit of hopping around. We're not going to have just one or two topics. We're going to have several topics we are going to cover today, so I hope you guys are ready for that. And first, I'm throwing you a surprise, a curveball, you may even think. Today, we're going to begin with a cognitive elite question. Like, whoa, no way, a cognitive elite question at the beginning? This is unheard of. But yes, believe it or not, we're going to begin with a cognitive elite question because we have two today. One I'm going to start off with and one I'm going to end with. And as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at highly-respected.substack.com, and that's at my highly respected Substack. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there if you haven't already. But you should have, especially if you're listening to the premiere of this episode, as all true highly respected fans are. The first cognitive elite question today comes from Pete. He asks, what are my thoughts on Trump endorsing Kevin McCarthy again? And I think some of you guys would probably realize this, that there's a lot of anger over Trump endorsing Kevin McCarthy. How could he endorse that rhino? How could he? How could he betray us again and endorse Kevin McCarthy? Is this the final straw for Trump? Is this time to say he's over? We're finished with Trump. And the short answer is no, obviously. I think out of all the things, like, I know I'm accused of being a Trump shill and a Trump loyalist and a Trump diehard. And, you know, I'll proudly wear that. I am ride or die for Trump at this moment. But I think a lot of people are getting a little too angry about this. There are things that Trump does stupid. You know, there are bad endorsements he does. Like, I would always point out a really bad endorsement he did, or rather rescinding endorsement, was in the Alabama Senate primary. He rescinded his endorsement of Mo Brooks, and he's essentially without endorsing Katie Britt. It looks like Katie Britt is going to win, even if Trump did. Maybe if Trump did endorse Mo Brooks, that would change the equation. She, you know, in the first round, she got 45%. Brooks got a little under 30%. I mean, Brooks could still pull it off. It's still, you know, there's still a possibility, but from all accounts, it looks like Britt is going to pull off the primary victory, unless, like, maybe Trump enters in and endorses Brooks. But Trump rescinded his endorsement of Mo Brooks, I believe, back in March. And, you know, all these people who love to complain about Trump, who love to attack Trump as the great betrayer, as the worst politician ever, and the biggest threat to nationalism, didn't say anything about that. Didn't say a word about him rescinding Mo Brooks. And Mo Brooks is a true, honest, America First nationalist. He's great on immigration. He's been great about calling out the war on whites for a long time. He was at the forefront in the Stop the Steal effort. You know, he spoke at, you know, all these rallies with Trump. He even got in trouble for the efforts he was involved in. You know, the January 6th committee is really interested in him and really going after him. Yeah, he's risked a lot for Trump. Solid conservative credentials all on pretty much every issue. And, you know, no one cares about that. But what has made people really mad? Him not endorsing Robbie fucking Starbuck in Tennessee, 5th congressional district. The person Trump endorsed got kicked off the ballot. Both Robbie Starbuck and the person Trump endorsed, Morgan Ortagus, got kicked off the ballot. Robbie Starbuck had just sued. He's now back on the ballot. I don't think Ortagus is going to be back on the ballot. Starbuck is not going to win this race. He is not a local there. The former state speaker of the House is running in this race. So are a bunch of other local people who are not actual carpetbaggers from California who just moved there in 2019 and are weirdos not running under their real name. Robbie Starbuck is not his real name. For some reason, he's running under like a pseudonym. It's like, you know, it's like Prince running as like Prince in an election or something. And he's running in a very suburban district. You know, I'm from that area. I grew up in that area. Very country club-esque. And he's running under the pseudonym with a ponytail. And there's just like so many weird things about him. And he's not even really America Firster. Like, I've followed Robbie Starbuck for a long time. And this guy is like delivering like basic bargain bin, like conservative talking points. Like, we're for we're against illegal immigration, but for legal immigration. And it's like Democrats are the real racists. It's like, whoa, we need to get this guy into office. We need to get the ponytail dude not running under his real name into office. And it's just so embarrassing. Like, if I think about that area, like even thinking about like my parents and like those like type of people, they would be embarrassed to vote for someone like Robbie Starbuck. And so it's like, if he was like really good on the issues and stuff and had really been pushing things forward when he was like just a mere Twitter personality, like I'd be all for him, but he's not. And he's just friends with a lot of MAGA Twitter, and all these MAGA Twitter types are just like, we're so fed up because they're friends with him. And all these people want to just deliver the shiv into Trump and support Ron DeSantis. So they're using this as an example to get mad at Trump for. Then there's the Pennsylvania endorsement, where at the time, all of MAGA Twitter wanted Trump to endorse Roger McCormick, not Kathy Burnett. Nobody was talking about Kathy Burnett, who is the bizarre black lady who was running that MAGA Twitter and conservative Twitter then embraced near the end of the race. And they got so mad that Trump endorsed his friend Dr. Oz. And as I've talked about in previous episodes, Dr. Oz is not an ideal candidate, but Dr. Oz has no political positions. He's also extremely charismatic, very popular with suburban women, and he'll listen to like whatever his advisors tell him. He could turn out to be very Trumpian, very America first. Roger McCormick instead is a Bushite, establishment guy who's just pretending to be Trumpy in that type of way. He's not that very good, and he's not entertaining or exciting or charismatic like Oz is. And it's like, why would Trump not endorse his personal friend, who Dr. Oz in 2016, at great risk, had a very friendly, sympathetic interview with Trump right before the 2016 election. Meanwhile, the entire media is calling Trump a Nazi and an evil person and a monster, and how could dare you give him a friendly interview? And Dr. Oz, to his huge television audience, gave him a friendly interview when nobody was giving him friendly interviews. So he even helped out Trump back in 2016. Meanwhile, Kathy Burnett, who everyone began to embrace, and the primary was calling Trump evil and attacking Trump, and she was just a nobody. So, look at the standards of when you're going about this. So, and in that Pennsylvania race, Trump's endorsement won. Dr. Oz is now going to be the Republican nominee. McCormick conceded. The MAGA Twitter favorite finished in third, didn't go into what looked like might be a recount. McCormick conceded the race to Oz. Oz is now the candidate. Once again, another Trump primary victory. Even all those people are saying Trump is over. So this is a long roundabout way of getting to Kevin McCarthy. Now, I understand. I don't really like Kevin McCarthy. I think everyone doesn't really like Kevin McCarthy. But let's go from why Trump's endorsing this guy. Kevin McCarthy, unlike a lot of establishment figures, and I think you really need to compare him to Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell's the other, leading figure on Republican Congress. Looks like he's going to be the Senate Majority Leader. Well, unless he decides to, step down or whatever. It looks like he's the previous Senate Majority Leader. He, he is a leader of the Republicans in Congress. And you got to compare the two. Kevin McCarthy is firmly loyal to Trump. And we all know about his comments that he made offhand in a private conversation or in a meeting with, Republican lawmakers, him denouncing Trump. But guess what? That might be what he says in private, but in public and in pretty much all instances, he goes up and tries to create loyalty to Trump and to the Trump base and do what Trump tells him to do, for the most part. And that is much better than you could say about McConnell. McConnell was publicly denouncing Trump and saying he's finished. McConnell also difference between McConnell and McCarthy. McCarthy doesn't really have any political ideology. He's just like whatever is most popular. If Trumpian America First stuff is most popular, he will go along with it. McConnell has these idiotic, respectable conservatism that he really likes. He is not going to go along with America First stuff. He is not look about how committed McConnell is to Ukraine. He said that Ukraine is the most important issue to our country, or the most important issue in the world. Think about that, that your leader saying that. Now, McCarthy, I know, is also saying things about Ukraine, but if Trump was in power and if Trump is telling him a different thing, he's going to change his mind. While McConnell is going to stick to his positions and undermine Trump. And also, McConnell Unlike McCarthy, when they were respective leaders of their house or delegations, McConnell worked actively to sabotage Trump as a president and undermine his legislation and other things. From people who are in the know of like what happened in the administration, they always said that McConnell would come over and ruin a lot of things. Like when Trump wanted to pull out of Afghanistan, one of the leaders of this effort was McConnell. Like we like to blame everything on Jared Kushner, but McConnell is about equal to Kushner in that regard. You know who's never blamed for these ruining things? Kevin McCarthy. So this is not so much like, wow, Kevin McCarthy is great, but it's like by comparison, he's much better than what alternatives you got. And when it comes to Speaker of the House, if Republicans win and McCarthy was the leader of the Republicans, why wouldn't he become Speaker of the House? Like when you win something, you are seen as the leader of this accomplishment. Why are you not then rewarded to Speaker of the House? Is there somebody else leading this effort? Is there somebody else who's a public face who is more responsible for this? And I'm not saying this is like to cheerlead on McCarthy, but this is just a simple fact, not just in politics, but just in life. Like imagine your company like has like a massive sale, and the guy who's the head of the department who's did this massive sale to get a promotion is expected to get that promotion, but instead they find some random salesman and just like, oh, we're gonna make him the promotion. I mean, that's like considered like unfair or unwise, or even like it's like with like it's like firing a head coach after winning the Super Bowl. Like that's in like respects like that what you would think of like replacing McCarthy. Like McCarthy can only be replaced if Republicans lose or they do not gain the majority in the House. Like if they don't gain the majority in the House, then we should be open to replacing him with someone much better. But if they gain the majority, he won. You reward victory. It's not like you don't fire the head coach after he won the Super Bowl. I mean, even though this is like how like a lot of like populist ink on Twitter relies on. They're just like so bitter and like have no concept of like loyalty and like and they're always talking about Schmidt and like rewarding friends and punishing enemies. But then like when it comes to like normal human behavior, like don't do this, just be like totally saying what we want to do, even though we have no loyalty to you. And this is like the thing about them. Like they're demanding Trump be like more extreme and more like in their interest, but none of them want Trump to run again. And they're open about this. Like we want Trump gone. We want DeSantis. And then they get mad when Trump doesn't do the exact correct endorsement. Well, even if he did, you still wouldn't like him. You want DeSantis. So I know people always get worked up about so many things. Like there are so many upsetting things going on in the world, in America in particular. Just going out and touching grass, you could see a lot of depressing things depending on where you live. You shouldn't be too depressed or black pilled. I'm opposed to black pills. A lot of people consider me a black pillar, but don't. But then you got guys who are like automatically demanding people getting really worked up and getting really angry and really blackpilled about minor things. They're just going to happen. Yes, in an ideal world, Trump would endorse somebody better. And he wouldn't endorse McCarthy. But this is the nature of the thing. And also, nobody serious is running against McCarthy in his primary. Like, I actually had to look up. I'm like, I wonder if he has any primary opponents. Well, in California, they do jungle primaries, so everyone's thrown in, like the Democrat candidate, Republican challengers, and they are all thrown in. And there's like a Democrat in there who, is a serious candidate. They are, they're not the Republican. So he does have Republican primary challengers. Or what I think that they're Republican primary challengers. The news article I pulled up doesn't specify what party, but I'm pretty sure these guys are. So the first, we've got a meteorologist named Ben Duell, or Ben Duell. I don't know how to pronounce it. He's the first time running for office, and what is he running on? He is running on that McCarthy is an insurrectionist and his support of a known insurrectionist. So maybe they want to support that. Maybe the populist Inc. wants to support this guy just because they want to get rid of Trump. The second guy goes by James the Deviant Davis. He's run in the past previously. He's a sound and systems engineer. I guess he's running on anti-vaccines or some sort. And then the next guy, Jim McCauley, is a retired accountant. who doesn't even live in the district, but he's running. He's going to move to the district. And his just whole thing is about privatizing Social Security and Medicare. So none of these people that are running against Trump are not against Trump, but against McCarthy are serious candidates at all. None of them are running on an America First agenda. So you got the one guy who's like a never Trumper, respectable person who wants to push back against the insurrectionists. This guy may be a Democrat, but I'm not quite sure. He may actually just be a Republican. So maybe not that. I think the guy who's nicknamed the Deviant is running as a Republican, and the guy running as the retired accountant running to privatize Social Security is also there. So none of these people are serious. They're not going to get any support. There's no reason that Trump's going to endorse the guy named the Deviant. And this guy, they even have a picture of him, and he's got massive ear piercings. So this is like a total joke. And anytime I always hear this, it's like, why did Trump endorse this candidate? And it's like, do you know who's running against him? It's a complete joke. And he's like not going to endorse like nobody jokes like some dude named the Deviant. So there's nobody running against him in his primary. There's no serious candidate there. None of them are even running on an agenda that Populist Inc. wants. I think Populist Inc. would not support the guy named the Deviant or the guy wanting to privatize Social Security. I'm pretty sure they're opposed to that. Runs counter to their economic populism. So those are his primary challenges, not serious people. Now let's think about who might run against McCarthy for Speaker. There's not really anyone wanting to angle for this because they know if they try to angle for this and McCarthy went, Republicans get the majority, they're going to, McCarthy is going to get the House Speaker. Because unlike most normal people, as I said before, if you do something well, they don't try to fire you because, people on Populist Inc. Twitter tell them to. They're generally operating on a different level. I mean, this is how the world works. If you do something well, you're rewarded and you get pushed up for a promotion. You do not get fired for making a big sale and then they pull some random guy out of sales to replace you or whatever. That's not how these things work. So who's going to run against them? All right. You got Steve Scalise who may angle for that. Steve Scalise is not angling for that. The real person they want is Jim Banks. Now, Jim Banks is the I think he's still the current head of the Republican House Study Committee. Very powerful conservative group within the Republican congressional delegation. And he's a very staunch, America First guy. People really like him. But what is Banks really competing for? He's currently competing to be the next Republican whip if on the pretense that Republicans are going to gain the majority in the House. And the current whip, of course, is Scalise, and then Scalise would be promoted to majority leader and McCarthy to Speaker of the House. Banks does not want to risk losing his sway with the leadership and upset leaders and to get a powerful position within the Republican caucus by then saying, I want to run for Speaker of the House. And also he's not going to do this because Trump just endorsed McCarthy. And Trump didn't have any reason not to endorse McCarthy because, as I said previously, McCarthy makes his public obedience to Trump and his swears loyalty to Trump and will do most of what Trump says, which is more than can be said of McConnell or even any others of the Senate leaders. So that's what they're going with. Banks doesn't want to challenge, so he's not going to do that. No, so then, Banks is like a serious candidate for the job, but Banks is, being much more reasonable and rational and practical about this. He's competing for the whip job against Elise Stefanik. And, he wants to keep people happy. He doesn't want to challenge, shake the boat for no reason at all. So he's not going to be replaced. So then they're just going on the, just whoever our wish list that are just not going to be there. So people want he should be endorsing Marjorie Taylor Greene or Paul Gosar. And it's these people are currently censured. They're not even allowed on committees. They're not going to go straight from having no committee assignments to being Speaker of the House. And so that's just unrealistic. And people always want this unrealistic extremism, and then when that's just not going to happen, and when it doesn't happen, then people get pissed and get really angry and black pill and just go into a spiral that's completely unnecessary. And as I said, they don't even want Trump. So even if Trump did this, they'd still be talking about how Heavy D, Ron DeSantis, is the superior candidate and we're done with Trump and whatever. And for all of Trump's bad endorsements, like Trump just endorsed Blake Masters. And Blake Masters is one of the best candidates we've seen in a very long time. Not just this cycle, but we've seen in a long time. He's pretty much running on everything that we'd want a candidate to run on. And he just endorsed him and likely secured his win in the Republican primary in the Arizona Senate, or the Arizona Senate primary. And he did the same for J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance has his problems, but J.D. Vance is also running on an America First agenda and is popularizing America First agenda for that. And he's doing that for many other candidates as well. And so you got to look at, like, some of these things are not going to be ideal. Some of the things could be bad. Like I always said, if like Trump had endorsed, one of the worst candidates in Ohio, he wanted to endorse Jane Timken, who is like terrible, is like a human robot. I'm Jane Timken, totally boring, totally establishment, just sucks. He did not do that. He endorsed J.D. Vance, and he could do a stupid endorsement in Arizona and elsewhere. The only thing I think when it comes to endorsements that are really bad is the rescinding of Mo Brooks' endorsement, but it is what it is, and I'm not going to be spiraled into supporting the favorite candidate among Conservative Inc. and the Republican establishment just because Populist Inc. is getting mad. And I really do want to emphasize this point. I said this a little earlier. There are so many negative news out there and things to get blackpilled and get upset about. Trump endorsing Kevin McCarthy is probably not high on that list. Yeah, it's fine to criticize him. I'm not saying you can't criticize him. I mean, we wish we could have an ideal, but this is the way the world works. It was going to be, I don't know why anyone's surprised by this. Trump's going to do this. McCarthy's a lackey. McCarthy's loyalty to him. And Trump is wanting to go into 2024 having the support of important leaders within the party. And by giving that endorsement to McCarthy, he ensures that McCarthy is going to be a full-on Trump supporter when it comes to the presidential race in 2024. And that's what's more important. And really, all these people who are mad don't even want Trump to run for president, already hate Trump, don't care. They don't care that Trump is endorsing Blake Masters and J.D. Vance and their candidates that they want to win. They want somebody else. And it's not like Ron DeSantis wouldn't endorse Kevin McCarthy either. And if you want him to get mad at like people he should oppose, it's probably Mitch McConnell. But Trump, guess what? Trump hates Mitch McConnell and is opposed to him. And a lot of his candidates he's endorsing are saying they're not going to vote for Mitch McConnell as majority leader if they get to the Senate. So that's about as much as you can hope for. And McConnell is way worse than McCarthy. McCarthy, for his stupid relationship with Frank Luntz, I agree with a lot of things that Tucker's attacked McCarthy for. Tucker's done a lot of great segments on Kevin McCarthy. I love Tucker giving that criticism to him, and that's constructive criticism because McCarthy pays attention to Tucker, unlike a lot of people on Twitter. I wish McCarthy paid more attention to me, but he doesn't. But when Tucker does that McCarthy gets the message and is likely to change his behavior based on what Tucker is telling him on the TV. So that's just something to keep in mind. And McCarthy is far superior to Boehner and Paul Ryan, who are the previous heads of the Republican House caucus. So we can definitely improve, and I definitely think Jim Banks would be much better. But Banks is, there'll be some day where Banks will probably be a Speaker of the House or a strong candidate for Speaker of the House, but it's probably not going to be for 2022. Maybe something after, maybe something during Trump's second term that can happen. So we'll have to see about that. Now I want to shift gears to a moment, and I want to offer some rare praise for Ron DeSantis. Everyone's like, oh, we'll never give Ron DeSantis credit for any good things he do. That's wrong. I will give credit when Ron DeSantis does something good. And Ron DeSantis is punishing the Tampa Bay Rays, the baseball team in Florida. They've issued a lot of woke stuff, actually. I'm not sure if it's like the Tampa Bay Lightning and Rays both really woke stuff. But they recently, called for gun control, and he said, well, you're not going to get state funds for your new practice facility or whatever. And he vetoed a bill to give them such funds. And so this is sending a good message. That is exactly what we need. Like state and local governments, not so much as punishing corporations. And a lot of people went head over heels over, over DeSantis standing up against Disney. That was good, and I also supported his Stop Woke Act. Unlike the things he was doing in 2021, these things he's doing in 2022 are much more tangible, much more concrete, and much more like serious. Like, these are good things that he's doing, and especially with the sports team, because it is time for Republicans to start standing up to these pro teams. There is no reason that these billion-dollar institutions like these, I mean, maybe I might be overstating the revenue, but there is no reason that these extremely wealthy institutions deserve state funding. They do not deserve taxpayer dollars, especially when they're turning into political organizations that attack states when they pass election reforms, attack states if they're not super pro BLM and demanding everyone supports BLM and having like pride nights and all this other woke stuff. There is no reason for a state to reward them with taxpayer dollars to build something that they can just pay off further on their own. So I fully support this. More states need to follow this example. And so good on Ron DeSantis for doing this. I really have to say, on the point of, get woke, go broke went like viral again on Twitter, or I saw it trending. It's like, when it comes to sports, this is not true. Like somebody pointed this out, or I found out recently that NFL last year went super woke. They had an ad declaring football is gay. That's what the ad says. Football is gay. In their end zones, they stenciled in racism in every end zone. And they were playing the Black National Anthem at marquee events. And donating money to left-wing charities. This is what they were doing. And did conservatives punish them? No. Every time I got onto Twitter on Sunday last fall, I saw all of right-wing Twitter, mostly mainstream conservatives, but even some distant right Twitter, talking about the latest game and going into detail. And it's like, look, I understand watching sports. Like, I like watching football. And I can't do that with NFL. I mean, this game is fun, but when it goes to the crowd, I'm so disgusted by the crowd and revolted by it that I'm like, you can't watch this. And it's like, you guys are like expecting, and a lot of these guys are like expecting like a civil war to happen or national divorce or all this type of extremism. And they're demanding that people like Trump and others do these radical extreme things. And they can't even give up the NFL. And the NFL is literally declaring itself gay and pro-BLM. And you guys won't do anything about it. You still continue to watch that slop. And it's like, people need their entertainment. People need their bread and circuses. I'm fine with that. Like, I'm not like saying I'm high above it. But when it comes to that, you're watching a propaganda vehicle for your enemies, and it's ensuring that you accept all the latest woke nonsense and insanity surrounding our society, maybe you should rethink like your loyalty to the, watching the NFL. I know I'm fighting a losing battle, but hopefully that people can get this. And that's also one thing I like about the DeSantis is that a lot of these conservatives are probably like, oh, come on now, it's sports. We need to support our sports team. Come on, man. Let's not have politics come into this. It's like, you know what? These sports teams have inserted themselves into politics. It's time for the politicians to strike back and say, no, we're not funding your shit anymore. You're paying for it yourself. No more taxpayer dollars for you. That's the deal that should be told to them. It's pretty clear and it should be a popular message. And conservatives need to support this and encourage politicians to do this rather than just sitting up in front of the TV and it's like, I would never do that to the Browns or whatever. And they got their stupid sports jersey on. And it's like, no, how are we going to ever change society if you're accepting this slop and aggressively accepting this slop and celebrating it and rolling around in it? No. We're going to end this train. And, if we want to make sports unwoke again, we've got to have Republican governors telling them, if you are going to support gun control, if you're going to demand that everyone pledge allegiance to Black Lives Matter, if you're going to, do these bizarre, I could even come see a day where NFL is putting on drag queen story hour at their events. You may think that's unrealistic, but I would put a bet on it. You'll probably see that before 2024. One team trying to do that. And, Republican governors and Republican state lawmakers can say, hey, you're not getting a single dime from us unless you cut this out. And that's what the message needs to be sent. And so I'm glad DeSantis did this, and I hope, that sends a signal to other sports teams and most importantly to other Republican governors and other state legislators that they need to do something about this. They need to give over their sports obsession, and, they can get back to enjoying sports, but they have to do something. When they have the power to do something to change their woke attitudes, they need to grab it and actually do it rather than just, saying like, oh, we can't insert politics in this. Sports has already inserted politics into their sphere. You can't escape it. To eliminate that presence, these state lawmakers have to do something. So kudos to DeSantis for doing that. But I still prefer Trump over DeSantis. I need to actually reiterate this. I've seen more people going full board DeSantis. Trump, just to repeat, I want to be quick. Trump instinctually is America first, even with his past statements. Like, Trump took on immigration at a time when that was a risky venture, when no one else was doing it. Everyone else in the primary field wanted to support amnesty. Trump was the one guy saying no, and that convinced Ted Cruz and a few others to change their attitude on that. He was the one person to say all these foreign interventions are stupid, and had the balls to say that, George W. Bush lied to get us into Iraq war, and all these other things. He's instinctually good on so many issues. Ron DeSantis is a politician, standard politician, conventional politician who's just embracing this stuff because he realizes it's popular. So I actually trust Trump more on these issues than DeSantis, and that's probably my main reason. There's many reasons, but I just want to emphasize that. And the main reason that DeSantis is doing these good things is because he's following Trump's example, and it's a lot easier to do these things on a state level than on the federal level. So, hopefully there's some influence going both ways. And when Trump gets his second term, Trump can do things similar that DeSantis is doing on the state level. But it's much easier to do things on a state level than it is on the federal level. Now on to another subject. As I'm saying, I'm subject hopping today. I hope you guys enjoy this. This is a thing I love seeing from Twitter, as a lot of things from Twitter inspire me. This last week, Jesse Kelly, who's like a conservative radio host, really tall guy. Generally, he's like pretty decent on subject. I mean, especially when it comes to conservatism. I think the dumbest things I don't like about it is like he's like really into the national divorce and Civil War stuff, and he's always like going up to the edge of Fed posting on a lot of things, and it's like very dumb. But like one thing, he'll talk about like blowing away people who like, I don't know, are doing libtard things. But when it comes to the subject of race, he, doesn't go up to the edge on this issue. He saw some graph showing like the performance levels of everyone, in the country, and the Asians are vastly outperforming everyone. And then, blacks, of course, are at the lowest level. And he simply said, is like, one graph shows you how culture matters more than anything. It's like, this is the most important thing. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what he said. And dissident right Twitter, of course, began making fun of him for this statement. And then he really got into like these boomer comments that liberals would say are racist, but he's intending this to be anti-racist. Like he's like saying like black urban culture is a cancer. It's like evil. It's poisonous. But it's just a culture. It has nothing to do with race, and we just need to change that. And, liberals would say that's like racist anyway, but it to conservatives' minds, it's anti-racist, and it's less racist than simply admitting that there are inherent group differences, and that a lot of these things, maybe it's culture, but there's also some biology to play into this as well. But they never want to admit that. And now, it's like probably is a lot like culture. But the one part I had on this is that, like, I've always heard that, like, we just need to change the culture. And then I'm like, what are the actual proposals to change the culture? And they usually go in two directions. They either go into libtard direction, where it's like more funding for schools, better teachers, more midnight basketball, more programs. It's like the same things we've been doing for 60, 70 years. We've been doing this for a long time. The results are getting worse. Just more money for them. Okay, so that's one direction, number one. Direction number two is boomer Fed posting is like mega boomer ideas. These are like imagining that America is like in a very different place than it is. It's like maybe 1990, and they're like, we need to ban rap music, ban sagging pants, force blacks to do math at the dinner table. Just like a massive like eliminate the First Amendment so we can turn blacks into standard white bourgeois people from like the 1970s. When boomers were growing up, and like make sure like we have mandatory handshaking sessions so they learn to hand shakes a man's hand like a man and work straight and do a job correctly. So we essentially send blacks to Clint Eastwood boomer movie boot camp. All of them are sent there. And this is how we change the culture. And this is how they actually talk. They're like that. It's like, we'll do these massive bans on all these things. And there's like even people in Jesse Kelly didn't respond about cultural proposals, but there were like people in there who were like responding to this. And some were just like total idiotic. It's like, nope. There was one person's like, nope, nothing to do with race. It's all culture. It's like when lights go out, other people like to play board games, but not my family. My family, they made us get to the dinner table and solve math problems. And I was like, first off, that's really weird. Like my family played board games, and it's like I think most families play board games when the power's out. I forget, Nate. That's at a clear point. When the power's out and there's like nothing to do, you grab a candlelight and play board games. But this person's like, no, you grab a candlelight and you do geometry and algebra. It's like we just need to make blacks do that. So you send in like the state Gestapo to like burst through the door. It's like the power's out. And they're like pointing guns at blacks. It's like, we have a geometry book you all need to do the work on right now. And it's like, oh, okay, we're going to make you all really smart. It's all culture, not race. And it's like, as the person's pointing the gun, and like, oh, lordy, okay, we'll play some geometry. And they'll get out the geometry. And then the mother probably doesn't know how to do this. I mean, I don't think a lot of Americans can remember geometry. And they're like, what the hell? And they're like, complete the problems. We need to prove race is not real. So this is like the boomer conservative vision. It's like we're sending SWAT teams into black households to ensure that they're not playing, but they're solving geometry problems during power outages. And then we're sending them to Clint Eastwood boomer camp to like act like how boomers imagine their childhood was. So they'll be straight citizens, and they'll be just as getting just as good of grades as Asians. And it's like, I don't think this is likely to happen. It's like extreme, massive social engineering on a level that is like, you might as well just talk about dragons coming back or something, or like unicorns appearing. Like, we don't have the money to just like send in SWAT teams to ensure that to ensure race isn't real and that people are doing math work during like even like not even during a power outage, but like maybe for homework and stuff. It's like, this is not how they're being raised. Like, there's so many other issues going on here that we just can't solve. But they always suggest these ideas, and also like banning rap music and stuff. Like boomers will still suggest this, and I'm like, white old people now listen to rap music. They'll be like, wow. I mean, I imagine Jesse Kelly's like a fan of Tupac and like stuff from the 90s and like 90s gangster rap that like boomers back then wanted to ban. And he may not want to say that, but they would generally say is like, we need to ban rap music. And it's like, now like rap music is unfortunately enjoyed by like wide swaths of the population. It's like the standard popular form of music now. It's replaced rock, and you're just gonna ban it, and like then they'll just like magically turn into like like white boomers. I don't think that's gonna happen. Also, you have to remember is that like black criminality was like extremely bad in the late 60s and 1970s, back when they were listening to music that boomers enjoyed, back when they were listening to soul and R&B and funk, back when they were listening to like Parliament and Marvin Gaye. All the boomers like this music. They were still like shooting each other and being violent and having a lot of problems back then. So I don't think it's like rap music is a response to that. Rap music is simply just depicting their average life that was occurring even before rap was like a thing. It's just like silly, and people just don't want to admit like things that are in front of them. Like, there are natural group differences. You could probably change the culture a lot. You could probably do a lot of things differently. But if your solutions either come down to libtardism or radical extreme social engineering that is not possible, like, you should think through these things. Like, if you were saying like maybe we could improve a lot of this behavior that we see through like tougher law enforcement, like, and that type of stuff, and not having a permissive attitudes in the school, like zero tolerance in the school to ensure that these problem kids are taken out, and maybe the kids who want to read or actually get an education or want to be well behaved, they're not following the example of bad students. Maybe we could do that. But it's also like, I don't, even with these changes, you're probably not going to get their numbers up to Asian levels. It's just, genes play a role. Like, it's not just all entirely culture. Like, culture does play a part. I'm not like saying it's like all genetics, like it's all determined from birth. Like, that's not true. I mean, like, you could be like, have a very high IQ and like be raised in a very shitty environment and you never reach your potential. And there are pretty stupid people who are raised in a good environment who then reach above their potential just simply by having the means. But, it's equal mix. But I mean, I wouldn't maybe say an equal mix, but culture does play a strong role, but not as much of a role like it's just like the sole determining factor. And this is just something that needs to be accommodated, and to continue to pretend that we can do radical social engineering to get black students to have the same achievement level of Asians is just fantasy, and it's never going to happen. And we need to create public policy around real life situations rather than living in a fantasy world where this is just never going to happen. I mean, it's just not. And so that's a problem with that. I actually do have a stance on Asian, because on Asian students, because there was another very bad tweet sent by a guy who surprisingly writes for like American Greatness and stuff, who was also responding to the same graph or same chart on student performances, or performances based on the race. So this guy's name's Dennis Safran, and he writes pretty much all the places he writes for are pretty good. Like City Journal's pretty good. American Greatness is very good. National Review, Federalist. Federalist is fine. Anyway, he usually writes. The first two places he lists are pretty solid places. But he responds to this graph, and he's like saying to Asian performance. He's like, whites have lost to Asians fair and square, and only the woke left and a segment of the MAGA right are unwilling to accept it. And it's just like so bizarre, and it illustrates this thing that like all the opposition to affirmative action now is not how it harms whites, or at least from the mainstream level. It's all about how it harms Asians. And look, whites are the main losers in this equation. Whites are the ones who, the majority of the country, ones who built the country, ones who laid the foundations for these great universities. And all conservatives can talk about is how it harms Asians. And one time I even saw like affirmative action harms like Asians and Jews. And it's like, well, doesn't it harm another group? Like, what? It's like just finding the random minorities that they can be like, you guys are racist. You're anti-Semites for affirmative action. And it's like, look, the reason why they're pushing forward this is to have fewer whites. And yes, the Asians like come out of this, but that's what it's harmed by. And so it's all centered on Asians, and they're just like obsessed with like having this Asian elite, and they're just like, oh man, they're just so much smarter and better than whites. It's like, we just love Asians, and it's like just weird. It's like, I think everyone will admit that they're performing better in a lot of areas. But if you talk to anybody who's like been in schools with like heavy Asian population, they will say that they're cheating is a little bit more rife among them than among other groups. This is a lot of people have always told me this from that. I mean, granted, these are anecdotes, not backed by hard stats, but backed by numerous anecdotes. Not saying that that's like it's all just due to cheating, but they're just like so eager for this, and it's a way of just like deflecting any racist accusations and just being enthralled with another group. It's a weird form of racial altruism. And actually, I do have a controversial take. I will explore this more, especially when affirmative action or racial preferences in education come out. But the one thing is like I'm worried about is if they did come down, racial preferences in education did come down, like then all our elite universities, rather than being 15 to 20% Asian or whatever, would then go to 40 to 50% Asian. And this is like a little weird situation for a group, a very small minority, and then just like to be like all like 50% of 40 to 50% of all elite college students and the ones who are going to rise up to the elite level. And when they do this, I guarantee you colleges are going to figure out a way to ensure that there are still like whites are being punished under the new guidelines of just supposedly meritocracy, and they're still bringing in like token minorities that they want there, like blacks and Hispanics, to offset the new standards that would be in place that would just be ostensibly merit based. And I think that is going to be a major issue going forward, is like just having 40 50%. And a lot of these people are going to be open to these ideas, these woke anti-white ideas. They're going to love the anti-colonials. They're going to love hearing about how our America was built on white supremacy and genocide, and that white Americans need to pay reparations for this. They're going to be demanding reparations for the Chinese Exclusion Act and terrible things done to Asians. So like, hold on. Not only, I mean, Japanese got reparations for internment camp, but I mean, other Asian groups are going to demand their type of reparations if there's black reparations. Like, hold on there, we got discriminated too. We want reparations too, and it's like, as long as the ball gets rolling, they're not gonna. I don't think this group is necessarily going to be allies. They're going to be even more fervently anti-white than the people already going to these schools, because they're going to have no connection to the past history. They're not going to see themselves in George Washington and the founding fathers. They're going to want a new country that reflects what they look like and reflects their history. And they're not going to be happy about learning about these great men in history and then learn that they didn't want any Asians here. So they're not going to be, open to America. They're going to remake America in the image that they want to create, and it's not going to leave much of a room for us poor Caucasians. So that's something to keep in mind. I wouldn't necessarily say the racial preferences in education are a good thing to stay in place, because there is a negative, but I want to say that there could be a situation where it's at least as equally bad and possibly worse than the current situation we have. And so that's something to keep in mind. I'll explore this more because affirmative action's on the Supreme Court docket this summer. They're expected to issue a ruling, so we'll probably have an episode more on that soon enough in the near future. So that is it on that subject. Now moving along, we're doing a ton of subject hopping, but we're now going to a New York Times article on the supposed phenomenon of the post-religious right. And this is written by a kid that I've always hated or dunked on Twitter until he rudely blocked me. This kid is Nate Hochman. He's always touted as the populist wunderkind, as like the future of the right. And he's like always touted as like, oh, he's just so smart and brilliant. And I will, once again, I'm giving a lot of credit to people I criticize, but I will give Nate Hochman credit for this article. It's actually a pretty good article. I didn't 100% agree with it, but it had a lot of interesting points, and it was not standard populist Inc. tier a telling of what they think the new right is. They like to use the term new right to describe themselves. And usually these descriptions imagine that the new right is like a Catholic version of the religious right, or it's just centered on economic populism. There's no cultural element, there is a cultural element, but it's like primarily just social conservatism. They'll maybe mention immigration and the identity and race stuff, but those are all just like not important to the main cause. It's all really just this usually just integralism project, which is not it. And Hochman in this argues in his article that the new right is much more secular than the past conservative right. And he cites Sam Francis here. So he has this section. He's saying, I'll have to read a couple of these paragraphs. These two paragraphs I think are the most important. In this sense, I'm quoting him, in this sense, the fierceness of today's culture wars is actually tied to the decline in organized religion. Frequent church attendance is correlated with more negative attitudes towards gay men, lesbians, and feminists. But as the pollster Emily Ekins noted in 2018, it softened respondents' views of culture war issues such as race, immigration, and identity. Non-church-going Trump voters are more likely to support a border wall, tighter restrictions on illegal immigration, and a ban on immigration to the United States from some Muslim-majority countries. They are less inclined to agree that acceptance of racial and religious diversity is at the core of American identity. While the majority of religious conservatives eventually fell in line behind Mr. Trump, the political and cultural energy he represented was primarily a reflection of the non-religious right. What is occurring on the right then is a partial realization of the program that the hard right writer Sam Francis, my voice outside of the quote, this is interesting that he's positively citing Sam Francis, but back to the quote. Writer Sam Francis championed in his 1994 essay, Religious Wrong. He argued that cultural and ethnic social identities are the principal lines of conflict between middle Americans and progressive elites, and that the religious orientation of the Christian right serves to create what Marxists like to call a false consciousness for middle Americans. In other words, political Christianity prevented the right-wing base from fully understanding the cultural war as a class war, a power struggle between middle America and a hostile federal regime. And he also talks about how Francis saw Christians' universalist ideas as at odds with the defense of American nation. I don't know if that's quite true, which was being dispossessed by mass immigration and multiculturalism. And so he mainly talks about how a lot of what you're seeing on this is very different from the religious right of yesteryear. And to talk about the moral majority in the 70s and 80s, it was primarily, citing on this religious stricture, and also a lot of leaders were religious figures themselves. They were major pastors who had significant sway over evangelical Christians. Today, there are some pastors still involved, but you don't really have a Jerry Falwell figure. Pat Robertson is still around, but he's like senile. He still hosts his show, and he doesn't have the sway and influence that he had in the 80s. And when you look at the leaders of this, they are not necessarily religious figures. And he points to Chris Rufo, Rufo sometimes talks about to ingratiate himself with certain elements. We'll talk about religious and faith. But he also talks about how he never really brings it up. And Hawkman can only find one time he brings up his faith, and it's just dealing with his wife's cancer. And it's something that's very nondescript and just like something that's very vague and abstract. It's not something that you would have seen in Jerry Falwell. And Rufo, even though I have my problems with Rufo, he is a defining feature of the right today, and the issues he's pushing are predominantly critical race theory and other things. And you can even see this in this protest at the drag queen event. It wasn't even drag queen story hour. It was just a full-on drag queen event for kids in Dallas. And it wasn't really led by religious figures. It was led by, like John Doyle and people like that. It was, they're religious in themselves, but they're not particularly known as religious figures. They're primarily known as political figures. And some of the people involved, I don't even think are Christians. Like that guy who does all the funny raps at like town halls and stuff. He was there. I don't think he's Christian. And so these are like the type of people who are representing it. That guy could be Christian. I don't want to get that guy upset. He's like, I am. But I don't know if he is or not. But it's a very much more of a secular push. And people have noticed that a lot of the arguments, when it goes into what DeSantis and others are pushing forward about this like anti-groomer stuff, it is not so much like we're indoctrinating these kids with they're not appealing to scripture. They're simply saying these kids want to, these are groomers who are trying to sexually pervert our children. And it's something just real, and they're not necessarily appealing to scripture that, even a secular person could understand. And critical race theory has nothing to do necessarily with what the religious right was talking about. And you even see when arguments against pornography, they're once again not necessarily, the main figures aren't necessarily appealing to scripture here. They're talking about the psychological effects, the negative psychological effects. They're talking about how it encourages sex trafficking and all these other things. They're not necessarily tied to how, the fire and brimstone that Falwell was talking about back in the day. And you can see even this Peel with sometimes. Now, some people try to bring back the religious vibe into this, and it doesn't necessarily come off as authentic, or at least for a lot of populist types and mainstream right types. It doesn't come off as authentic as, people were never going to doubt Pat Robertson, Falwell's faith. But now you're seeing like guys who are open atheists like James Lindsay talk about demons and stuff. And it's like, well, you're an atheist, so you don't even believe in demons. Why are you talking about demons? And it's the same with the right-wing Twitter. It's like these people who are not necessarily religious before, and then they're just talking about blaming everything on demons and demons this and they see these mass shootings that happened in Philadelphia, or there's a new one in Chattanooga, and they're like, demons. Like, this is the solution. It's just a way of coping from actually addressing what's there and just adding a supernatural element there that's not necessarily, I don't think is necessarily, not, as I always say in the podcast, not disputing the existence and the influence of evil spirits in the world and maybe their involvement. But I think when you're talking about political activity and like things that are in front of us, you're not trying to present yourself as a crank or as a kook. And when you're just like seeing like, a magic shooting happen, you're just like, it's a magic shooting rather than like it's demons, like they possess these kids. And then a normal person is like, I think you might need to check into an insane asylum. They're just going to think that you're a kook for saying this stuff. So I don't know, it's going on, and even going so back to like a lot of these cultural war issues, there's much more of a secular bent to it. And his point that like the strongest Trump supporters, this might not be reflected on Twitter, but this is usually reflected on polls. And it's also, but there are still very strong evangelicals for him. This may have changed since the primary, but in the primary, his primary supporters were non-church going evangelicals. That was his core element. And there's even elsewhere in other countries where the core element for nationalist parties are people who identify as Christians, but they're not necessarily regular church attenders. Like, I know this is the case in Sweden with the Swedish Democrats. I believe this is the case in Denmark with the Danish People's Party, and a lot of other places where they find that, church going, a lot of the people are still church going in these countries, which there's not a lot of church going on in northern and Western Europe. But the people who do, their politics are generally associated more with like the center and the center right. Not necessarily, I always say not necessarily. I have a friend who always who complains about me saying that, but I still say it anyway. So not saying that these people aren't not voting for nationalist parties, but the real core element, like the people more likely to incline, or the people who are saying that they're voting, are people who will self-identify as Christians. They'll say, they're not saying they're atheist, agnostic, or none of the above, or something else, or a not true. They're simply saying that they are a Christian, but they're not a regular church goer. And so that's like a core demographic now for a lot of the Trumpian movement and the movement in the West. And also we do have declining church attendance. So the point is, I think there's a couple people are coming at with trying to revive a new religious right. There's the integralists of type of, or like a lot of these populist types like Sohrab Ahmari, Adrian Vermeule, these type of guys who are trying to imagine that the Trump base really wants integralism. They want Adrian Vermeule to like bring over some like archbishop and like tie that to the president, and now this is what's ruling the country. And most of the Trump base, if they're devoutly religious, a lot of them are evangelical, and that's still like evangelicals when it comes to polls are still way more right-wing on a lot of these issues when it comes to immigration, when it comes to like Black Lives Matter, police shootings. They're generally, when they do polling among religious groups, they're generally rate the highest as the most right wing. And I think there was a poll that showed that they were the one religious group where a majority of them, white evangelicals, were concerned about whites losing their majority status. Only group demographic that was assigned that had a religious category to it that was concerned about that. So they are there. So it's a lot of it evangelical. So I don't think the evangelicals are wanting an integralist state. That just might be my view. And so they're like trying to recreate that, and they're trying to impose it, and they're trying to make it more respectable because they realize that if they're talking about the race and identity stuff, they're going to get canceled, and they're not going to get that respectability. So they're trying to impose their own view and try to make up and like saying, oh, it's actually about our issues. It was all just about supporting unions and supporting like this, this type of Catholic, like wanting to have like the Catholic Church run our state. I don't think that was like what people were voting for. I mean, maybe you're for that, but this is a big tent thing, and I don't think everyone's necessarily down for that. And then there's kind of the more clownish aspects of populism, or more populist elements. The not the people just writing at Compact, writing highfalutin articles at Compact. The real MAGA Twitter influencers, and they're trying to build on a religious right too theme with like all the demon posting and did in this stuff. And a lot of these people, as I said, like pointing to James Lindsay and some others, they're not actually religious themselves. And so they just kind of get into this. It gets retweets and stuff. But I think if you translate a lot of this stuff, to normal people, they're going to be like, what? And I always want to say, like, you got to avoid looking like a kook because our ideas are already radical and considered fringe, and you don't need to add additional kookiness to it. So that's always something I try to avoid with this. Maybe I'm a little bit of kook. Maybe some of the viewers are a bit kook, but you got to, tone down to it and imagine like you're approaching a normal person because already by like opposing mass immigration, opposing Black Lives Matter, noticing that there are actual inherent differences between groups, racial and ethnic groups, and all these things, that's going to put you in the kook category. And some people just want to keep adding to the kookiness. And, because maybe it appeals to that base, but it's ultimately just going to make you more weirder and more assigned and more secluded into the ghetto. So you got to get out of that. But a lot of these people who are getting into the, like, I don't know, the trying to pretend that they're like super religious and, talking about demon posting and stuff from MAGA influencers, they're trying to avoid talking about the real issues with this, as I keep saying, and just add a supernatural element. So what Hawkman and also Adrian Vermeule and them did not like Hawkman's article. They think that their religious right is coming back, which I think it's not like saying it's like, everyone's turning into atheists and stuff. I just think it's a very different type of right that we're having now. There's going to be, and you definitely still need devoutly religious people, whether evangelicals or Catholics or whatever. You actually have to still keep them in and represent their issues, and what they care about is important. But I don't think that they're necessarily the defining people, or that their concerns or everyone in that concerns in the tent. And it is somewhat of a big tent movement. I think he was, some of the aspects that Hawkman talks about, it's barstool conservatism, and he's talking about Brandy Love and these porn stars, and there's like a very lowbrow element that you bring into Trumpism that he talks about, that I think even everybody on the distant right would say, like, I think the main problem with Brandy Love is that it's like, you don't want to have a political movement that's like, has porn stars as leaders. It's just like, no. And then I don't even feel like I need to explain that. It's like people are just gonna be like, what is this? This is like a strip club as masquerading as a political movement. People don't want that. And Barstool itself, which is kind of bled in, and I've talked about how Dave Portnoy could be a potential, like, one day a guy that Republicans could rally behind, but I think his comments about abortion ensured that that would never happen, because he said that, if Republicans make ending in Roe v. Wade, he would just vote Democrat. And I'm like, okay, he could never run as a Republican as that. And I think even like some of that Barstool conservatism doesn't necessarily, even the Barstool guys themselves are just focused on this like very lowbrow, pornographic type of right wing that I think even like most people, that also doesn't represent really it is. But there is an element where there's like people who maybe they're not that like religious, but they'll still identify as Christian. They still try to go to church for Christmas and Easter, but they're really getting turned off by a lot of the woke stuff. They're really worried about the critical race theory. They are seeing the anti-white racism and stuff, and they're like beginning to move in a more nationalist direction. But I think if they're maybe not believing that this, when black crime happens or something, that it's actually demons at work. They're still like they're still on a level that you have to be pragmatic and talk to them where they're at, and not be a total kook to them. So I think there is that element there, and it is rising, and most of this race and identity stuff is at the forefront of what nationalism and the right is now. And that's still going to include, like, the religious right is still going to be an element in it. And I think, and Hawkman concludes that the religious right is still going to be a strong element, but it's not going to be the leading element of the right, but it's going to be still an influential element. So it's not like moving to the right, even for the distant right, or our narrow niche of the right that it exists. And I don't think it's like right to say like we're now going to be the totally atheist or secular right or something like like something like that, like the angry atheist conservatism or something of that, or amazing atheist. I don't think most Zoomers would know who that guy is, probably for your own good. But I'm not like necessarily arguing for that, but it is going to be something that's not motivated by the stuff that the moral majority was talking about back in the day. And it's certainly not going to be what like Sohrab Ahmari and Adrian Vermeule are talking about with their common good conservatism. Like, that's already, like, the liberals are already rallying behind that point. That's not what the Trump base wants. That's not what motivated people to vote for Trump in 2016. So it is something there. I think it's an interesting article. I don't think everyone's going to fully agree. I didn't fully agree with it either. And I think he's pointing out some of this, like, the pornography, like the Brandy Love situation. And it's like imagining that these guys are just like, the caricature of like a Barstool sports viewer who just wants to like watch porn and is getting mad that liberals are getting in or getting in the way of that. I think that's going a little bit too far, and that's implied in the article. But otherwise, I think it is like a good article, and it's a useful corrective to a lot of this stuff. And I've talked about this before, where there's a ton of these articles coming out. It's like, what does Tucker Carlson represent? And then they go and interview like Sohrab Ahmari and Adrian Vermeule, and they talk about like the common good conservatism, and they talk about like all this stuff that has nothing to do with it, and they just imagine that it's their little like pet project that's focusing solely on their issues and excluding the race and identity stuff, which that's not the case. And Hochman's bringing that to the fore and reminding a lot of people that it's likely not going to be in the form of a new moral majority. It's going to be a little bit more secular than it was in the past. So this is a topic to talk more about in the future, but that's just my thoughts on it. And hopefully some of you guys agree. But we still have one more topic to go along with, and this is another cognitive elite question. As a reminder, I'm going to bring up the reminder because we got to get more people signed up for Cognitive Elite. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for Highly Respected Substack or the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highly-respected.substack.com. And make sure to sign up for those IQ supplements if you already haven't. And this question comes from Johnny Chungus. He said, Scott, is the push for gun control and debate around it after Uvalde comparable to the debates after Sandy Hook or even Parkland? I would say no. For one, that there's like, we have such a crazy time now that there's like so much news happening that nothing can like, one news topic cannot be the main topic for like 2 weeks. And like the Uvalde shooting is already past its shelf life. In many respects, it's already past its shelf life. They're really trying to artificially keep it alive, and they've gone in multiple directions. They've tried to defund the police. They're trying to go gun control. They're not even quite sure about which angle in the gun control. Some ways they're being limited. They're like, we're just wanting to expand background checks, or we're just wanting to do like some minor thing, maybe like ban a specific type of rifle. They're going to more expansive where they're banning all assault weapons, or they're even like trying to do more gun control on handguns. I don't know how that's going to work. They're primarily doing that as like a crime measure because they're realizing how many crimes and mass shootings are being committed by with handguns by Magic Americans. So they're trying to also add that element in there as well. So they're not really quite sure about this, but it's, the attention towards this has already passed. And with Sandy Hook especially, that was the news story for at least a month. I remember that happened in early December 2012. I was just about getting ready to move to DC for my big internship at Campus Reform, Leadership Institute's Campus Reform. And that was like a massive news story. I saw people posting about it on Facebook, my normie friends. Like I was not in politics at that time. I was about to get ready into the political news world. And I saw all my normie friends talking about it, and just like everyone, and the news was talking about it nonstop for like a month. And I remember when I first got to Campus Reform, if you guys are familiar with the website, the first story I ever wrote was also dealing with the Sandy Hook thing, because it was a study had been published about how I believe it was like 60% of millennials plan on buying a gun or plan on owning a firearm. And back then, millennials were the young people. Very few millennials were 30 yet. So this is back when we were the young people, and all the news media was talking about how millennials suck and they just don't want to grow up and they need helicopter parents. So this is all what was going on in early 2010s. So I wrote this story, and then Drudge picks it up because they were still focused on the gun control battle and how much focus was on Sandy Hook. And so my first article I ever wrote was picked up by Drudge Report. So that's something to keep in mind. That's a little bit of Greer lore. But that article got deleted because Campus Reform, when I got outed as an evil racist, they deleted my whole archive. So not like there's anything that important. So I'm probably misremembering. I forget if it was like 2/3, but it was at least 60% of millennials who were saying that. So that was still a major news focus at the time, that where Drudge Report was just finding random news articles from conservative sites that dealt with gun control and fighting over the gun control debate and bringing them in. And I remember the gun control debate was like the first thing Congress was debating when I got to DC, along with amnesty. And there was a much greater push because Obama won a victory in the 2012 election. The Democrats retained their Senate majority. They gained a few seats in the House. Republicans still had the majority. Republicans looked like they were on the verge of extinction, and that's why they needed to adopt amnesty. And they're also telling them that they needed to adopt gun control. And Pat Toomey, who's now retiring for the Pennsylvania Senate seat, that Dr. Oz is hopefully going to take, he got a bill together with Joe Manchin. Like, they're trying to show, like, this is moderates coming together, Republicans and Democrats coming together to solve a gun control. And, it's like expanded background checks and that type of stuff. And they came together for this bill, and it still got, I think a few Republicans voted for it, because it was like, if I'm not mistaken, it was like 54, 46, something like that. I can't believe I remember the number, but it was not enough to overcome a filibuster, and it died. And they knew that the House wasn't going to take up that bill because Republicans are still in control. And this happened, a few months after Sandy Hook. It didn't happen in December or in January. I think it happened in February, March. So that was like a few months past. And Sandy Hook was still had a cast over, or was it overcast? What you guys know what I mean, over the American public discourse, that Congress is still debating this issue. Well, I think America's already moved on from Uvalde, and there's so many new mass shootings that happened, such as what we saw in Philadelphia last weekend, another mass shooting in Chattanooga. I mean, Chattanooga is not that big of a city. It's like fewer than 200,000 people, and they've had two mass shootings that are widely covered in the news media in a month, in less than a month. I think it's I think the one that happened was 2 weeks ago. So it's hard to keep one mass shooting in the public attention. And when it comes to Parkland, and also go back to 2012, there was not much news happening at this time. This is a time where a week-long cycle could be about Obama's suit choice. Okay? There was one time a whole news cycle about Obama saluting a Marine when he's getting on his helicopter, Marine One, and he had a latte in his hand. And so the latte salute was a major news story on Fox News. And they were always looking for things that they could obsess over, that because there wasn't the type of news that we're seeing now wasn't there, but the still news ecosystem was there, because you still had all these brand new online news sites, especially on conservative media. Conservative media is just popping up on the internet. Breitbart, Daily Caller, all of them are starting to emerge, Washington Free Beacon. And so there's a desire for news. And, so one big news thing, they would just talk about it for weeks and weeks at a time. And it could just manage to take over the news cycle. And, this is also when it happened. I think the infamous Alex Jones, Piers Morgan debate happened a month after Sandy Hook as well. So on guns. So it takes so it was a much more bigger issue, while Uvalde's already going away. And with Parkland, it was also happening in a time where there's more news, not as much as today, because you got to think of just all the news that's happening. You got Ukraine, you got a crazy border, you got the border invasion, you've got rising crime, you've got Biden trying to do idiotic things, you've got Trump possibly running for all, running for presidential election. You've got the upcoming midterms. You've got you've got Roe v. Wade potentially getting overturned this summer. You got affirmative action being potentially overturned this summer. There's so many things happening, and it's hard to keep focus on just one news story, which is so many crazy things happening. You've got monkeypox. I just think about all the issues that we've got. And so you didn't have this in 2012. 2018, you had a little bit more because Trump was there, and Trump was always liable to cause news. And at that time, we hadn't had a mass shooting of that type of that nature in a while. The type of deranged loner who just shoots up and kills a ton of kids at school. I might be, somebody could probably fact check me on this, but this hadn't happened. I mean, they tried to claim that the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting was of that nature, but that was terrorists doing that. Most of the mass shootings that we had prior to this were Muslims doing this stuff. And so they there's just a crazy person. We don't know why they did this. But this is the first time we had a classic Columbine type mass shooting. And you also had all these kids, the Parkland school shooter kids, or school shooting kids, the bald chick, and all those kids emerged, and the media was celebrating them, and they all dedicated their efforts to gun control. And they were also using this as a way to own Trump. The media loved any news event that they could use to own Trump. And these kids wanted to own Trump. So they ran with it for a month at a time. But nothing really happened from that. So even that, and they had a massive march in DC for that, and whole cameras, and they turned these kids into celebrities. And then people just promptly forgot it, probably because 2018 had more news happening than in 2012, late 2012, early 2013. So it was able to get off the news cycle. So with Uvalde, I think there's too many things going in the picture. And also even the Democrats, when they're their message and aim, they're wanting to focus on domestic white supremacist terror. And that's a little bit separate from the gun control push. And they want to just they'd rather just focus on Buffalo more than Uvalde, but they're having to focus on Uvalde because people obviously view murdering kids worse than murdering adults. And so that's what's gaining the public attention. But over time, there's just too much news, and it's going to be drowned out. And they're having talks in Congress, but why would Republicans do this? Democrats have a much thinner majority than they did back in 2012 or 2013. And they know they're going to get clobbered in the midterms. And Democrats are just flailing about for an issue that'll help them in the midterms. And they're currently landing on gun control, but they'll probably move on to something else. They've been trying to move all over the place. They've tried January 6th, domestic terrorism, Putin, Ukraine. That doesn't even work. But they're just they're flailing about for anything that they can have. And they'll probably move back to abortion once the Supreme Court issues its ruling on Roe v. Wade. And so they'll get misdirected again. And Republicans, I don't think, are eager to do gun control. Not like in 2012, because it also happened. There was a much greater push for them because Republicans got clobbered in the 2012 elections. Meanwhile, at this time, Republicans think that they're going to dominate in 2022 in November. So there's not much of a motivation to do this. And there's even an example. There was a Republican who was in a district near Buffalo, or I think it covered parts of the Buffalo area, who came out for gun control, and now he's announcing he's no longer running for re-election. So, I think even Republicans, they know that they shouldn't even consider these stances. So I don't think anything's going to come out of it. There's much less attention, much less push than there was after Sandy Hook and Parkland. And so I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And it's going to be overtaken. And anyway, there's the real mass shootings that are happening are what's happening every night in these urban areas. And those are just going to continue on, and expanded background checks and armed teachers or whatever is not going to solve that problem. So that is it for today for Highly Respected. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll have an incredible IQ supplement later this week, so I hope you guys tune in for that. So until next time, stay respected.